Welcome to the deep dive, where we really get into the details, the stuff that matters.
It's about going deep.
Exactly. And this is a brand new episode, by the way, from our NEXGROW podcast series. So, buckle up. Today, we're tackling a big one, a really important one, achieving zero harm in tailings management. We've got, let me tell you, mountains of research, guidelines, even some real-world stories that'll make you stop and think.
It's about connecting those dots.
That's it. Seeing the bigger picture. And for you listening, our mining managers, our tailings professionals, this isn't just some abstract concept.
This is the core.
Exactly. The heart of your operations, your responsibility. It's about the people, the environment.
Absolutely. And we've seen, unfortunately, way too many times what happens when things go wrong.
It's heavy stuff.
Those damn failures, the impact, the devastation. It's a stark reminder that we have to get this right.
No doubt about it. So let's talk solutions, ways to actually make a difference. We've been digging deep, no pun intended, into the Global Tailings review. And, well, it's pretty sobering, isn't it?
It is.
It really makes you think.
One of the things that really struck me, just the sheer scale, the number of tailings facilities out there. The Global Tailings portal lists over 700.
700.
And that's just what we know about the tip of the iceberg, really.
Ooh.
Experts estimate there are probably over 8,500 globally, and thousands are still active.
Thousands. See, that's a lot of potential risk. No wonder everyone's talking about zero harm. But what does that even mean? Is it even possible?
That's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And the Global Tailings Review, they make it very clear. Zero tolerance for human fatalities, that has to be the goal.
It's a big goal.
It's ambitious, for sure, but it means a fundamental shift, a whole new way of thinking about tailings management.
A shift, huh? So we're not just talking about, tweaking a few things here and there.
Mm-hmm.
This is bigger, right?
Yeah. Much bigger. It's about moving away from this idea of tailings as just waste, a byproduct to be dealt with.
Right. Seeing it differently.
Exactly. Seeing them as a resource to be managed responsibly, and not just for the short term, but for the entire life cycle.
And that life cycle, that's the thing. That can be a lot longer than people realize, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We think about mines' lifespan, but those tailings, they stick around.
They do. Long after the last truck has left, they're still there. And that's where the traditional approach, that net present value, that NPV, that's where it falls short.
Short-term thinking.
Right. It prioritizes those short-term gains, but it often fails to account for the true costs, the long-term costs of a tailings facility, especially if something goes wrong, the cost of failure, the cost of closure.
It's like kicking the can down the road, hoping someone else deals with it later.
That's it. And that's why the Global Tailings Review really stresses this whole-of-life cost approach. It's about looking at the entire picture, the long game, not just the initial cost, the construction, the operation, but those long-term environmental costs, the social costs, the potential liabilities. Closure, that's a big one.
Taking responsibility for the whole journey. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this whole-of-life approach, it sounds like we need to fundamentally rethink how we even see the tailings management system. It's not just one thing, right? It's a whole bunch of interconnected pieces. So how does the Global Tailings Review, how do they approach that?
Well, they use this analogy, and it's a good one, of inner circle and outer circle. So the inner circle, that's your day-to-day, the nuts and bolts, the design, the construction, the actual management of the facility itself.
Okay, got it.
But then there's the outer circle, and that's where things get really interesting. That's the governance, the oversight, the company culture, even how do you engage with communities? All of that factors in.
It's like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah.
Every part has to work together.
Exactly. Both circles are vital.
Okay, so let's get specific. Within that inner circle, the operational side, where do we even begin? Mm-hmm. What are some practical things that mining companies can do right now to minimize risk?
Well, one area where we're seeing a lot of really, really interesting stuff is alternatives to traditional tailings storage.
Okay.
Like moving beyond just those big ponds, And one of the really promising avenues is something called dewatering technology.
Dewatering, yeah.
It's about getting as much of that water out of the tailings as possible.
Okay, so dewatering, I've heard the term, obviously, but to be honest, I'm not always sure I could explain it to someone else. What are we actually talking about here?
Sure. So picture this, right? Instead of that traditional image, the watery tailings pond, you have these tailings that are more like a thick paste almost.
Okay.
Or even dry enough that you can stack them. That's the goal with dewatering.
Interesting.
And there are a few different ways to achieve that. So you've got your thickened tailings, which is, it's a step in the right direction.
Right.
Then you've got paste tailings, which is even thicker. But the really, really interesting stuff, the game changer, is filtered tailings.
Filtered?
That's where you're talking about recovering like a huge amount of the water, up to 90% of the water used in processing.
Wow, 90%.
Which is huge, right? Especially in places where water is scarce.
Absolutely, that's huge, especially these days.
Mm-hmm.
So less water usage, that's a big one. But what about the stability of these, drier tailings? Are they less likely to have those, those liquefaction issues, those failures?
It's the beauty of it. Dry stacked tailings, they're way more stable, much less likely to liquefy, even in an earthquake. And because they're drier, they take up less space, smaller footprint, which is good for the environment, right?
Less land disturbance, for sure. So less water usage, increased stability, smaller footprint. It sounds almost too good to be true. There's got to be a catch, right? What are the challenges with implementing these dewatering technologies?
You're right. There are always challenges. Cost is a big one.
Right.
The equipment, especially for filtered tailings, that can be expensive, and you need specialized people to run it, to maintain it.
Yeah.
And not every mine site is suitable for every type of dewatering, so finding the right fit for your specific conditions, that's crucial.
It's about finding the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned something earlier, co-disposal. That sounds interesting. What is that?
So co-disposal, this is where it gets really innovative. It's about thinking differently about how we manage these tailings instead of always storing them separately.
Okay.
One method that's gaining traction is called paste rock, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. You take those filtered tailings, the ones we were talking about, and you mix them with waste rock.
Okay.
And what you end up with is this material that's actually pretty strong, stable enough that you can use it for things like backfill in the mine, even building covers. It's a way to turn waste into a resource, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, one man's trash. Turning a liability into an asset. I like it. Are there other co-disposal methods out there?
There are, and one that's really interesting is called eco-tails.
Eco-tails.
And it's similar to paste rock in that you're combining tailings with other materials, usually waste rock. The focus with eco-tails is on creating a structure, like a landform that you can revegetate. So you're not just containing the tailings, you're actually creating something that kind of blends in with the environment, supports plant and animal life.
It's a more, I don't know, it just sounds more holistic, more in tune with nature. But even with all this amazing technology, all this innovation, we can't forget about the human element, right? These facilities, these operations, they impact real people.
100%.
So how do we make sure that those human consideration, those social aspects, are part of the conversation, part of the solution?
It has to start with really engaging with communities.
Not just checking a box.
Right. Not just going through the motions. It has to be genuine.
Yeah.
And it has to happen throughout the entire process from day one.
From the beginning.
So from site selection, right, where is this facility going to be? All the way through design, construction, operation, closure, the whole 9 yards.
It's about building relationships, right? Building trust.
Exactly. Because those communities, they're the ones who are going to be living with the legacy of these facilities long after the mining company is gone.
That's a really good point. They have to live with the consequences, the good and the bad. So transparency is key then.
Transparency is huge. Being open and honest with communities about the risks, the monitoring data, the steps that are being taken to mitigate any potential impacts.
Being a good neighbor.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about accountability. When we talk about preventing these failures, ensuring zero harm, who's ultimately responsible?
Right. The buck stops where?
Well, there are a lot of people involved, obviously, but 2 roles are absolutely critical. The responsible tailings facility engineer, the RTFE,
okay,
and the engineer of record, the EOR. So the RTFE, they're the ones on the ground day to day. They know that facility inside and out. They're responsible for the design, the operation, the monitoring, all of it.
Okay, so they're in the trenches. What about the engineer of record?
The EOR, they provide that independent oversight. So they're not involved in the day-to-day, but they review everything. The design, the construction. Yeah. They make sure that everything meets the highest standards. They have the authority to say, hey, hold on, this isn't right. Or even stop everything if they think safety is being compromised.
So they're like the independent auditors.
Yeah.
Making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly. But even with the best engineers, you need systems, right?
Yeah.
Robust systems to support them.
That makes sense.
And that's where data management comes in.
Data, right. Everyone's talking about data these days.
Data is crucial. Mm-hmm. You need systems for collecting it, storing it, analyzing it. All of the data related to that tailings facility.
Okay.
And it can't just be locked away somewhere.
Right.
It has to be accessible not just to the engineers, but to management, to the communities, to everyone who needs to see it.
Transparency again, being open. But what kind of data are we talking about? What's most important to track? It's overwhelming, right? All this data. Where do you even start?
Yeah.
What should mining companies, what should they be focusing on?
It's about priorities, right? You can't track everything, but some things, they're just non-negotiable.
Like what?
Think about the things that directly impact safety, the stability of that tailings facility. Water levels, for example, that's a big one. Any movement, any displacement. Seepage rates, rainfall data, even seismic activity in the area. These are the things you got to keep an eye on.
So it's about identifying those key indicators, those early warning signs that something might be off.
Exactly. But here's the thing, data in itself, it's not enough. You can have mountains of data, but if you're not doing anything with it, what's the point?
Right. It's about making it meaningful.
Exactly. Analysis, that's the key. And not just humans poring over spreadsheets, we're talking about using technology.
Algorithms, AI, all that.
Exactly.
Right.
Smart algorithms that can detect those anomalies, those patterns, those trends that we might miss.
So we're talking about like a proactive approach, anticipating problems before they even happen.
That's the goal. Predictive even. But let's be realistic, right? Even with the best monitoring, the best technology, the unexpected can still happen. So how do you prepare for that? The what ifs.
That's where the emergency plans come in.
100%. And the Global Tailings Standard, they're very clear on this. Companies need a plan, a detailed plan for dealing with potential failures. What happens if this dam fails? What happens if there's a massive earthquake? You have to think about all the possibilities, assess the risks for each scenario, and then crucially, you have to have clear procedures for responding.
So it's like a playbook, right? Everyone knows their role, what to do if the alarm bells start ringing, but how do you make sure those plans, how do you make sure they're more than just, words on paper?
Practice. That's the key. You can't just write a plan and stick it on a shelf. You have to test it. You have to run drills.
Fire.
Exactly. But for tailings dams, simulate different scenarios, practice evacuations. And it's not just for the engineers, for everyone who might be impacted, the communities too, they need to be part of this.
It's about being prepared. But we know, right? We know from experience, even with the best intentions, mistakes happen. And sometimes those mistakes, they have tragic consequences. So how do we learn from those past incidents, those failures? How do we make sure history doesn't repeat itself?
It's a tough question, but it's the right question. And I think it comes down to culture. We need a culture of continuous improvement in this industry. The Global Tailings Standard, they really emphasize this, learning from past incidents, not just within your own company, but across the entire industry.
Sharing those lessons learned.
Exactly. And that requires transparency. Are companies willing to share their incident reports, even when it's uncomfortable? Because we need to have those difficult conversations. We need to be open about what went wrong so we can all learn from it.
So it's not about blame. It's about understanding.
Exactly. It's about getting better together.
Now, we've talked a lot about the Global Tailings Standard, and it's clearly really important, a driving force for positive change. But are there other groups, other organizations that are pushing for these higher standards?
Absolutely. One initiative that's doing some really interesting things is the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative.
Okay.
And as the name suggests, it's investors, people with a financial stake in the mining industry, they're the ones who are pushing for change.
They're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. They have this really comprehensive questionnaire for mining companies. They really grill them on their tailings management practices. And they were instrumental in developing that global tailings portal we talked about.
So they're using their influence to make a difference.
Exactly. And it's not just happening at the industry level either. International organizations are starting to pay attention.
Like the UN.
The UN Environment Assembly, UNEA, they've actually passed a resolution calling for stronger regulations for tailings management. And they're publishing reports, raising awareness, really pushing for a more holistic approach to mining.
So there's a lot happening on a lot of different fronts, it seems like. But all this talk about responsible tailings management, it always brings us back to the end, right? What happens to those tailings when a mine closes?
Closure is a really important part of the life cycle. It's not the end, it's the beginning of a new chapter.
Okay.
And it's about creating a positive legacy, something that benefits everyone. But it takes planning and it takes careful execution.
So where do you even begin? When you're thinking about closing a tailings facility, what are the key things to keep in mind?
Well, the first thing, and this is true for pretty much everything we've talked about, there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Every situation is different.
Exactly. The best approach, it depends on the specific tailings, the local climate, the environment, what you plan to do with that land in the future.
Yeah.
But one common approach is capping. You're basically covering the tailings with layers of material, usually soil and rock, sometimes both. It prevents erosion, keeps rainwater from seeping in, creates a more stable surface.
So it's about containment, right? Keeping those tailings in place, preventing them from spreading.
Exactly. And there are other methods too. You can use geosynthetic materials like liners to isolate the tailings. And then, of course, you have to think about things like acid mine drainage. If you've got tailings that are generating acid, you need special techniques.
That's a whole other challenge for sure.
It is. Sometimes you might need to dispose of those tailings underwater in deep lakes or ocean basins, or you might use dry cover systems, layers of clay to seal them off. And sometimes you even have to treat the tailings chemically to neutralize that acidity.
So it's complicated, a lot to consider. But even once you've figured out the best method, the actual closure process, that must come with its own set of hurdles, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest challenges is that long-term stability. These tailings facilities, they don't just sit there. They settle, they can erode, there might be earthquakes. You have to design these closure systems to last, to withstand the test of time.
So you're building for the future, not just for today.
Exactly. And then there's water management. That's huge. Rainwater, it can be a big problem. If it infiltrates the tailings, it can leach out contaminants. So you need good drainage, carefully designed and implemented.
So it's about controlling that water, making sure it doesn't become a problem. But closure, it's not just about containment, is it? It's also about trying to restore the land to bring it back to life.
Rehabilitation, that's a critical part of responsible closure. And it's not just about making things look pretty, it's about functionality. You want to revegetate those sites, create ecosystems that can sustain themselves, maybe even use that land for something else, agriculture, forestry, even recreation.
Wow, so you're turning those former mining sites into something positive, something that benefits the community.
Exactly. But to do that, you have to think carefully about the rehabilitation process. What kind of plants are you going to use? What kind of soil do you need? It's a science.
So how do you choose the right plants, for example?
You need plants that are adapted to the local climate, the soil conditions, but they also have to be able to tolerate any residual contaminants in those tailings.
So tough plants, survivors. Are there any projects out there, any examples that our listeners can learn from, places where they've done a really good job with tailings rehabilitation?
Oh, there are some amazing projects all over the world. One that comes to mind is the Diavik diamond mine up in Canada. They've actually rehabilitated a tailings facility into a wetland.
A wetland. That's incredible.
It's pretty amazing. It's now a habitat for all sorts of birds and animals. It's a real success story.
It's inspiring. But are there any new technologies, any cutting-edge approaches to rehabilitation?
There's some really exciting stuff happening with bioremediation, which is basically using microorganisms, tiny little creatures, to break down contaminants in the tailings. It's like harnessing the power of nature to clean up our messes.
That's amazing. So it's like we're using nature to heal nature.
Exactly. And then there's phytomining, which is using plants to extract valuable metals from the tailings. So you're not just cleaning up, you're actually recovering resources.
That's incredible, turning a problem into an opportunity. But rehabilitation, it's a long process, right? It's not something that happens overnight.
No, it's a long game, for sure. You have to monitor those rehabilitated sites, make sure those ecosystems are thriving. You have to collect data on plant growth, water quality, soil health, and you have to be prepared to make adjustments along the way.
So it's a constant process of learning and adapting.
It is. It's about stewardship, taking care of that land for the long haul.
And what about the communities? How do we involve them in this closure and rehabilitation process?
Community involvement should be a part of every single stage. From planning to implementation, engage with communities early on, listen to their concerns, incorporate their knowledge into the decision-making process, and give them opportunities to participate, whether it's monitoring or stewardship activities.
It's about working together, right?
Exactly. Building a shared vision for the future of that land.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of tailings management. We've covered a lot, and I hope you've learned as much as I have.
It's a fascinating field, and it's constantly evolving.
It is. And one thing's clear. Responsible tailings management, it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about a commitment to doing things the right way. It's about people, it's about the planet, and it's about the future.
It's about making sure that mining leaves a positive legacy.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for those higher standards, because together we can make a difference.